Hello, good afternoon to all of you. As Marie-Claire cannot attend that webinar, I'm going to replace her in the host role. In the sad circumstances where we are, the Chamber has set up that webinar to review the SBA assistance for small businesses and not-profit that are offered by the federal government. Lauren, who is an associate and accent poet, is going to be the presenter of that webinar. So let's go.
Sure. Alrighty, so let me pull up PowerPoint. Alrighty, so thank you for the introduction. So I will be mostly talking about the Paycheck Protection Program today, the PPP, and this is essentially, well, it's been touted as a completely forgivable loan provided by the federal government, but as we'll discuss throughout the webinar, there will be some caveats to that. So let's just begin. So here's what we'll be talking about. The CARES Act, what is it? The PPP, the SBA, what are all these parties? Who's eligible for such a loan? What the loan can be used for? How will it be forgiven? And what happens to any amounts that are not ultimately forgiven? So let's start at the top, even though I'm sure everyone has heard all about this already. So the CARES Act is the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act. It was signed into law on a Friday, March 2020. It's a $2 trillion economic stimulus, but around $350 billion it has been allocated to help small businesses through the PPP, which is administered by the Small Business Administration, the SBA. So the SBA often has loan programs for small businesses, and they've expanded their existing 7A loan program to encompass the PPP. And so the PPP is set forth in the CARES Act in sections 1102 and 1106, if anyone's interested in actually reading the text of the act, but essentially I'm just going to give a rundown of all that good stuff. And the ultimate goal of the PPP is to keep people employed, basically keep the federal government from paying unemployment when they can pay these businesses to keep people on their payroll. So very broadly speaking, these loans may be 100% forgiven if borrowers maintain their payrolls during the crisis. But like I said, there are caveats to that, and there are specific instances where I won't go into it because everyone will have to run their individual numbers, but it could be that you do everything perfectly according to the language of the act and you're not forgiven 100% just because how the numbers play out. So I have to add this disclaimer, the SBA is releasing guidance almost daily. The act is pretty well written for how fast it went through, and they're lucky that they're couching the PPP program within an existing program of the SBA. But with that comes the issue of what rules from the SBA are being imported to overlay over the PPP program. So that it leaves us with a lot of questions. So far we have a lot of questions about the forgiveness aspect because there's been a lot of questions answered about the actual application process. So that information is just forthcoming, and so just keep an eye out for the SBA official guidance. And I will say that lenders have a lot of latitude with this program, so a lot of questions will need to be answered by your individual lender. So who is eligible? You'll see a lot of websites say 500 or less than 500 employees. But this could be important for people, for example, in the upstate of South Carolina who run manufacturing, for example. The SBA's size standards for businesses within specific industries actually apply. So if you think that you are over 500, but you could be in one of these industries, I urge you to Google SBA size standards, and there should be a really nice regulatory chart, probably from Cornell website, and it will show the respective industries and their size standard. And very recently, as I noted here, the new guidance indicates that this also includes a revenue threshold. So before we were thinking that if you had a high revenue threshold SBA size standard, but you went over the 500 employees that you wouldn't be able to apply, but they've now imported revenue threshold as well. So like I said, I urge anyone listening who falls above the 500, just to make sure, look up the SBA size standards to see if you still apply. Unfortunately, it only includes 501c3s with fewer than 500 employees. It does not include 501c6, which I've gotten a lot of questions about that. It includes different individuals such as sole proprietors and independent contractors, and some other miscellaneous groups that usually aren't eligible for SBA loans. So there are these things called affiliation rules within the SBA guidance, and the SBA has recently made clear that they are importing the SBA traditional guidance to overlay the PPP program. However, within the Act, they say that the affiliation rules do not apply to certain industries. So namely, if your business is qualified as an NAICS code 72, so this is food or hotels usually, the 500 employee rule is applied on a per physical location basis. So as long as you don't have, as long as you have 500 or less than 500 employees per location, you'll still be eligible. You are also eligible if you're operating as a franchise or if you receive financial assistance from a licensed SBIC, which is an SBA approved small business investment company. So one of the biggest questions when you're applying for the loan and when you're trying to determine eligibility is who is included as an employee. Unfortunately, well, yeah, I would say unfortunately for a lot of people, this includes everyone. So even if you hired someone for a week as an intern, you would, under current guidance, you would include those individuals. So it's part-time, full-time, and any other status. It is not to include independent contractors because the SBA has recently stated that the independent contractors can apply on their own. So you are not to include them now. So if you receive a 1099, you can apply on your own behalf and you are not included in your quote unquote employer's employee count. So this includes employees from a temp agency or any other kind of concern. It also includes, as I said, they imported the affiliation rules, so it includes employees of affiliates in most instances. And here's the regulation 13 CFR section 121.301 if you're interested in reading. It appears to include both foreign and domestic affiliates based on this new guidance. So if you have a parent company abroad, you will most likely have to include those employees in your employee count to determine eligibility. You had to be in business on February 15th, 2020, so you can't just go out and start an LLC for the purpose of this loan. However, the SBA is eliminating a lot of their usual criteria for eligibility. So you don't have to prove that you sought credit elsewhere and were unable to attain it. As an aside, the SBA usually has this rule where you have to prove that you tried getting credit from a more traditional lender or source. They're doing away with that. You don't have to prove that. A personal guarantee for the loan and collateral for the loan are not needed. And this is just for the PPP. I'm going to go into the EIDLs later, which are a little bit different. You also need to certify a few things written here. Mostly, you're going to have to certify that in good faith, you're saying because of the uncertainty of the economic conditions, you need this loan in order to maintain your payroll. So there is a presumption of need under the PPP. That is to say, if you think there's a chance within the next few months that you'll have to lay someone off, the idea is that you will presumably meet this good faith certification. So how much can you borrow? It's been touted as a $10 million loan in some news outlets, but please be aware that it's going to probably be less for a lot of people. So it's up to 10 million, but it's 2.5 times the borrower's average monthly payroll cost from the year prior to the loan. So you're going to have to calculate your 12 months prior to the loan and then take the average of the monthly payroll costs. And if you weren't operational in 2019, you're going to just do the total monthly payroll costs, the average total monthly payroll costs for January and February 2020. And I will say, so the last bullet here is that there are some different nuances for seasonal employers, and one of them is for calculating how much you're eligible to borrow. So please take note if you're a seasonal employer, there are some differences throughout the Act, one of the most important of which is how much you're eligible for and how to calculate that. So the $1 million question, so what does payroll cost mean? The Act has a very specific definition. So here's the definition literally from the Act. For employers, the sum of payments of any compensation with respect to employee. That is and it lists all the different ways that you, or different means that you include in payroll costs. Notably, it does include payment required for the provisions of healthcare benefits, including insurance premiums, payment of cash tip or equivalent, etc. So I encourage everyone to take a hard look at your payroll costs and just try to maximize that 2.5 times amount that you're eligible for, because you can't double dip. Essentially, you have to apply in one fell swoop and hope that you get the correct amount that you need. I will say don't inflate, because like I said, they will be looking at your self-certification and all the numbers were properly provided. But just really make sure that you're accounting for everything provided for under the Act. And so for sole proprietors and the other self-employed individuals, you're going to look to your income. And just like there are different nuances for seasonal employers, there are different nuances for self-employed and independent contractors and those sort of employees. So keep an eye out for those sort of different nuances. I will say that the SBA has not provided much in terms of guidance for how the loans will operate for those self-employed individuals. So what is not included in payroll costs? Just as I said, you have to be vigilant in terms of determining what is included. You also have to be vigilant in excluding certain things. So a lot of confusion as to number one. At first, when people read the Act, it seemed as though if you had an employee who made over 100,000, you discounted them from any calculation. However, it's since been clarified by the SBA that it acts as a cap, that 100,000. So, and that's just annual salary of 100,000 that acts as cap. So as long as people aren't making, or you count up to 100,000 for purposes of payroll costs whenever you need that definition throughout the Act. Taxes imposed, certain taxes imposed are not included. Any compensation of an employee whose principal place of residence is outside of the US. So this is going to be very fact specific. I can't really offer that much guidance in terms of what that means. You'll have to take a hard look as to what that person's principal place of residence is. There are different factors, and just take a look at if they're going to return to the US, how much time they've spent abroad, that sort of thing, in determining whether you can certify that they are within the US for purposes of the PPP or abroad. And this is important because it's some interplay between other acts recently passed surrounding coronavirus. So you cannot include in payroll costs qualified sick leave wages for which a credit is allowed under Section 7001 of the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, or similarly under Section 7003. So make sure that you're discounting those credits that were allowed under this act. So everyone's asking, how do I get full forgiveness? Essentially, it breaks down into a few different components when calculating forgiveness. One issue that you will look at is what you spent the money on. That's one determination. Another determination is your payroll. So who did you keep on your payroll and how much were they paid? So starting with the first factor, a borrower is eligible for loan forgiveness equal to the amount they spent on certain items within an 8-week period. So I will say in parentheses, it says when funds are dispersed. However, I have heard from some lenders that they are considering the date on which the SBA accepts the application in their e-trans system. So if it's really important to you, it might be a day or two discrepancy between when the funds are dispersed and when the SBA accepts the application in their system. But if it's important to you, then I would clarify with your lender which date they are considering the origination of the loan. So the costs that you can be forgiven of during the 8-week period are payroll costs. So it's using that same definition we went over earlier. Interest on mortgage obligations incurred in the ordinary course of business. This does not include principal, so you can't use these loan proceeds to pay off your loan, just interest. Rent on a leasing agreement and payments on utilities. So the Act includes electricity, gas, water, transportation, telephone, or internet. There's no further guidance about what these sort of things exactly would entail. So I've been telling people just keep really detailed receipts, and it could be on the back end that more is considered a utility than we thought, or even less. So just be vigilant with documentation, and that's kind of a theme throughout this whole thing. And for the last 3 bullets, those contracts have to have been in place by February 15th, 2020. So you can't go sign up for internet service and try to get it forgiven tomorrow. So as I mentioned, are kind of the 3 ways that you're 3 things they look at for forgiveness, one of which is what you spent the money on, which is what we just went over. And then the other 2, generally speaking, have to do with if there was a reduction in number of employees or if there was a reduction in their wages paid. So there's still a little guidance about the forgiveness aspect of the Act. Like I said, there's been a lot of guidance about the application process. That makes sense because everyone was just rushing to get their applications in. But we are anticipating more guidance on the back end about the application for forgiveness. And it doesn't say this in the Act anywhere, so a lot of online articles have not added this to their prior documentation yet. But the SBA has stated that no more than 25% of forgivable sums can be for non-payroll costs. So going back to this slide, payroll costs, this first bullet is going to have to be 75% of the amount that you want to be forgiven. And the final 3 bullet points can only be 25% of the amount. So the first prong of forgiveness that has to do with payroll is reduction based on employee count. So, and there's this whole calculation, and I've written in words here, but just try to follow along, and I encourage everyone to really draw out timelines and payroll numbers and just make sure that you have a chart going forward to keep track of all this information. But the potential forgivable amount is, so the amount spent within those 8 weeks for those 4 things is going to be multiplied by the following equation. The average number of full-time equivalent employees per month for the 8-week period divided by either, and you have a choice here, the average number of full-time employees per month from the same period last year, February 15th, 2019 to June 30th, 2019, or January 1st, 2020 to February 29th, 2020. So as I keep saying, you could do everything correct and you could still have a reduction if the numbers aren't correct or don't play in your favor. So that's why I encourage everyone to take a hard look at these numbers and really calculate to see if there's a benefit to choosing either one of these benchmarks when comparing your 8-week numbers. And again, like I said, there are these nuances for seasonal employers. And here's another one. Your date range is going to be the first of the choice above. So the second prong, having reduction in employees in any way, will be reduction based on reduction in salary. So payroll costs, and then, so this, whereas the last one is about headcount, this one's going to be per dollar. And so for any employee who did not earn during any pay period in 2019 wages at an annualized rate of more than $100,000, so again, that $100,000 cap, if you reduce their wages greater than 25% compared to their most recent full quarter, so probably Q1 of 2020, you are going to be reduced in your amount of forgiveness by the reduction over 25%. So just be careful about any reductions in wages, meaning everyone's reading this to include people who have had their hours cut because that directly correlates to a reduction in wages. So just be vigilant in terms of, and we'll talk about it, but you're able to cure both of these reductions. So keep meticulous notes on any decisions that you've had to make between February 15th and April 26th, because that's the date set out in the Act, as we'll discuss. So like I said, there is the opportunity to cure these 2 types of reductions that would notch down your eligible forgiveness. So if there was a reduction in employment or wages that occurred between February 15th and 30 days after the enactment of the CARES Act, which I believe would be April 26th, basically the government will forgive those if by June 30th you eliminate the reduction in employees or reduction in wages. So essentially, like I said, really take the time to draw out those timelines and make sure that you have all your numbers correct, because there are a lot of different timelines floating around and you want to make sure that you have your payroll straight for each one of those timelines. And I will say the SBA hasn't really given any guidance about what a cure by June 30th would look like for a reduction in wages. So one question that I have for them is, do you have to have an agreement in place with the employee that you're not going to reduce their hours anymore? I'm not really sure what that looks like at this point, unfortunately. So the forgiveness application, basically what we know of this process is set forth in the Act. And essentially they just say that you need the documentation of your payroll and a few other things. What I've been telling people is essentially what you needed to apply for the loan, definitely have that straight for the back end when you apply for forgiveness. And just keep meticulous notes of what happened during the 8-week covered period for the payroll costs, mortgage interest, leases, and utilities. Keep copies of checks used to pay all these sums, and keep meticulous documentation verifying both the number of employees and how much money they made during February 15th through June 30th and during the covered 8-week period of your loan. So you need all of these dates in order to successfully fill out the application for forgiveness. And I will say, like I said, we don't have much insight about what the forgiveness process looks like at this point, but it is set forth in the Act that the lenders have 60 days following the application to approve or deny. So if it's the unfortunate fact that maybe you had too many non-payroll costs, or you had to let someone go, or the numbers just didn't work in your favor in terms of full forgiveness, you know, it could be that your forgiveness is barely notched down. And so what will happen to those sums? Well, for the remaining sums, there is no prepayment penalty, so you can just pay back the money that you were loaned. If you need the money and you don't have the money to pay back right away, then the loan continues with really favorable terms, a maturity date of 2 years, an interest rate of 1%, and you have 6-month deferment of payment of principal, interest, and fees. However, I do want to note that the interest continues to accrue during that 6-month period. And no collateral or personal guarantee is required on the back end either for this resulting loan. And so the SBA has an application here. So what I've been urging people to do is, if you're interested in the PPP loan, take a look at this loan, get everything that's needed for this loan, or according to this application. However, I will say that the lenders, from what I've seen, each one has their own application process. So it's a good benchmark in terms of what you'll need, but the lender will definitely have a more specific process that you'll need to follow. So, like I said, generally, you'll need all of your payroll information from the year prior, employee count, payroll costs, how much they were making. Remember that bulleted list with all the different ways that you calculate payroll costs. You also need the NICS number, which is your industry number, and that's important for determining employee count. You also need just your basic business information. So who you are designating as your point of contact, corporate structure to determine affiliation and employee count. So do you have a holding company? Do you have sister companies? All of that information you'll want to disclose to the lender. I will stress that one of the most important things in this process is a connection with a bank. So if you have a pre-existing connection, please reach out to them first, because a lot of banks are only talking to people that they have a pre-existing relationship with. If you don't have a pre-existing relationship, I urge you to look into an SBA approved lender and try to establish that as soon as possible. As I mentioned a few times throughout this presentation, you will need to self-certify the information that you're providing on the application. So please know that it's unlikely that fraud teams on the back end will really look into misunderstandings as to the law, especially because they open the application process prior to all of their guidance coming out. However, that's not just an excuse to provide information that's is bad. So maybe trying to fudge your numbers in terms of employee count or payroll costs, because they will be looking in these areas specifically for fraudulent misrepresentations, especially because they're urging banks to make these loans as fast as possible, even though the banks are concerned about fraud. So just be vigilant with what you report, make sure you have a basis for it, and just be prepared to make that self-certification. So kind of shifting into the EDILs or EIDLs. Here is the application eligible entity verification from the SBA's website. So the economic injury disaster loan is actually a pre-existing loan program. They did make one change to it within section, I believe it's 1116 within the act, where they're providing a grant, and we'll talk about that $10,000 grant. But this is a pre-existing loan program. It's a broader set of people who are able to apply than the PPP. It includes ESOPs, so employee stock ownership plans. And most notably, for a lot of people, it allows 501c6 nonprofits to apply, whereas before, namely, it was only 501c3 able to apply for the PPP. So I urge you to take a look at the SBA's website. They have this application. It's very streamlined for the EIDL, so you can poke around and see if it's something that you'd be interested in. Some basics, like I said, it's originated by the SBA directly, so you don't need that pre-existing relationship with a bank in order to get this loan. The max loan amount is $2 million. And as I mentioned, you can request an up to $10,000 advance, which will be supposedly distributed within 3 days, but I've been reading a lot of news and small businesses are saying that they haven't gotten it within 3 days. So don't bank on the 3-day mark, but it does say that it should be within 3 days. You're not required to pay back the loan advance if you're denied a loan. So we'll say that it said up to 10,000. There's been conflicting guidance. So one group came out with guidance saying it's 1,000 per employee up to 10,000. And then they deleted that guidance off the internet. So at this point, we're a little bit confused. It should still just be up to 10,000. We're not sure what kind of limits they're imposing on that number. And here are the maximum interest rates. So almost 4% for businesses and almost 3% for nonprofits, up to a 30-year maturity date. And unlike the PPP, you will need collateral or personal guarantees for these loans. So collateral is required for loans over 25,000, and personal guarantees are required for loans above 200,000. And so the PPP language within the Act allows you to refinance EIDLs, and it's very particular language, so I've included the verbatim language from the guidance here. Refinancing an SBA EIDL loan made between January 31st, 2020 and April 3rd, 2020. So I won't bore you with my voice in reading this, but essentially, if your EIDL loan was not used for payroll costs, it doesn't affect your eligibility for a PPP loan. But if it was used for payroll costs, your PPP loan must be used to refinance your EIDL loan, and proceeds from an advance up to 10,000 on the EIDL loan will be deducted from the loan forgiveness amount on the PPP loan. So you'll see questions on PPP applications about the EIDL and asking if you've applied during certain dates. This is what it's referring to. They want to know if you have received an EIDL loan for the same purposes as the PPP loan. So essentially you can apply for both. I've been telling people the general rule is you want to use them for different purposes. So the PPP loan proceeds are really for payroll. It's the Paycheck Protection Program. The EIDL is really good if you have maybe disruptions in your supply chain or maybe outstanding contracts that you need to pay. That's where the EIDL comes into play. You can use the EIDL for paycheck purposes, but like I said, it's subject to this guidance. And there we go.
Okay, thank you, Lauren. Before leaving, I want, to ask 1 or 2 questions.
Sure.
And is there anything specific that people who are under 1099 or for non-profit organization that we should be aware?
So your bank will require different information if you are a 1099 independent contractor, for example. And so you'll need your tax returns, your what you disclosed as income, because it's likely that they are going to be using that in lieu of payroll costs to determine your maximum eligibility for loan amount. For nonprofits, I think the biggest rub that's come up is the fact that people thought that 501c6 nonprofits would be eligible for PPP, and they came out and said that they're not. Really, only 501c3s and some other random veteran or tribal organizations are allowed to get the PPP. However, 501c6 groups are allowed to get the EIDLs. So I think those are the biggest things. Outside of that, for the 501c3s, when you apply for the PPP, it should be the same application. I think the application will only change for the independent contractors to the extent that you just need different documentation.
All right, so thank you very much. So for me, as a summary, I understand that we have to take a hard look of our number if we want to get the benefits of these programs, and also the timeline, because it seems very, very important, and keep a track of everything, because the money may come, but after that, we may have to provide, all the information to justify everything. No?
Yep, that's, I think, the biggest takeaway for everyone is that you need to just have meticulous documentation, because just like it's been a mad dash to apply, it's going to be a mad dash to get that forgiveness. And so lenders, they're already hesitant to make these loans. And so you just want to make it as easy on them as possible by having everything prepared.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Lauren. And I hope that you will get a lot from that webinar. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you.
Have a nice day. Bye-bye.